Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a pretty interesting take on a president who's, well, let's just say he doesn't usually spark fiery debates.
Definitely not your typical headline grabber.
Right. We're talking about Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
Peanut farmer, cardigan sweaters.
That whole image.
Exactly. But this Time magazine article we're diving into today throws a real curveball. They actually claim that Jimmy Carter was the most successful conservative president of the last 5 decades.
It's definitely a bold statement. You don't usually see those words Carter and conservative in the same sentence.
No kidding. So we're going to really dissect this claim today and see if it actually holds up.
Should be fun to dig into this one.
Absolutely. So the article kicks things off by contrasting this image of Carter as, kind of meek and ineffective.
Yeah, like a bit of a pushover.
With the argument that he was actually this powerhouse of conservative policy, particularly when it comes to smaller government and free markets.
Yeah, they paint a picture of a guy who was deeply committed to those principles, almost like a secret Republican hiding in plain sight.
Okay, so where does this argument even begin? Like, how do they connect Carter to this conservative label?
Well, they actually start with Carter's own words. He described himself as a conservative progressive.
Okay, wait, that sounds like a total contradiction. How can you be both conservative and progressive?
Right. It seems like an oxymoron at first, but it actually reflects the unique blend of beliefs that Carter held. He was very much in favor of things like civil rights and environmental protection, which are definitely hallmarks of progressive thought.
Right, the classic liberal stances.
Exactly. But at the same time, he was also deeply fiscally conservative. He advocated for reduced government spending, a more streamlined bureaucracy.
Less government intervention overall.
Exactly. He was all about that. So it was this interesting mix of progressive social values with a very conservative approach to economics and the role of government.
So he wasn't afraid to challenge the norms of his own party then. Did he actually follow through on these fiscally conservative ideas, or was it all just talk?
Oh, he absolutely walked the walk. Even back in his 76 campaign, he was hitting hard on the need to cut government waste and reduce spending. And once he got into office, he didn't back down from that message at all.
Did he actually take any concrete steps to achieve that?
Oh, yeah, he did. Like in his 1978 State of the Union address, he flat out said that the government can't solve every problem. He argued that it couldn't single-handedly eliminate poverty or just fix the economy by throwing money at it.
Wow. For a Democrat, especially back then, those are some pretty bold statements.
Very bold. It's definitely not the typical big government liberalism you might expect from a Democrat.
No kidding. I bet that didn't go over too well with everyone in his own party.
You're right about that. The article actually quotes a union leader who, get this, compared Carter to Calvin Coolidge.
Oh, wow. Coolidge. Talk about a blast from the past. He was like the poster child for small government conservatism, right?
Exactly. So that comparison really shows how Carter's economic policies were rubbing some people the wrong way, even within his own party.
So he was catching flack from his own side, but did these policies actually make a real difference?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The article goes on to argue that Carter, not Reagan, deserves the title of the Great Deregulator.
Whoa, hold on. Reagan's the one everyone always associates with deregulation.
I know, right? It's like textbook Reaganomics. But the article makes the case that Carter really took on deregulation head first because he truly believed that excessive government regulation was a big part of why the economy was struggling with stagflation in the 70s.
Okay, just to back up a bit, what exactly is stagflation again? Sometimes economics makes my head spin.
Basically, imagine prices going through the roof, unemployment skyrocketing, and the economy just completely stuck. That's stagflation, a really nasty combo of stagnation and inflation.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was definitely a tough time, and Carter was determined to find a way out of it.
So how did deregulation fit into all of this?
Carter saw it as this key to unlocking economic growth. He believed that if the government could just get out of the way, businesses could flourish, competition would increase, and prices would naturally come down.
Sounds like a classic free market approach.
Exactly. And you know what? He actually wasn't wrong.
Okay, so what industries did he actually deregulate? Like, give me some concrete examples.
Well, he started with airlines and trucking. These were areas where even some of his biggest critics in his own party, like Ted Kennedy, saw the need for change. They wanted more competition, a better deal for consumers, and it actually worked. Thanks to Carter deregulating the airlines, we're now flying like 4 times as many miles, at less than half the cost per mile compared to back then.
Wait, so my cheap flight to Miami last month, that's thanks to Jimmy Carter?
You got it.
Wow. Mind blown. But wasn't deregulation a pretty controversial move? Weren't there concerns about potential downsides?
Oh, there were definitely concerns, especially from folks who benefited from the existing regulations. Change is never easy, and there's always pushback. But Carter was determined to push forward because he believed that the long-term benefits outweighed any short-term challenges. And remember, the trucking industry also saw a big shakeup. The Motor Carrier Act of 1980 really loosened those regulations, leading to more competition and lower shipping costs, which helped businesses and consumers in the end.
Okay, so Carter's impact was a lot bigger than people realize. He wasn't just messing around with these abstract policies. He was actually making changes that had a real impact on people's daily lives. Did he stop at airlines and trucking? What about other sectors?
Nope, not at all. Carter's administration also took aim at energy deregulation. Remember the energy crisis of the 70s?
Vaguely. I was just a kid then, but I remember those long lines at gas stations and those crazy high prices.
Right. Well, Carter was determined to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, and he saw boosting domestic production as the solution.
So rather than just reacting to the crisis, he was trying to address the root of the problem.
Exactly. And while it didn't magically solve everything overnight, it did lay the groundwork for greater energy independence down the road.
It's fascinating how much we take for granted these days. Affordable travel, access to energy. We don't always stop to think about the policies that made those things possible.
It's true. We often forget about the historical forces at play behind the scenes.
Okay, now I'm really curious about this FCC revolution the article mentions. What role did Carter play in shaping the media landscape we know today?
This is where things get even more interesting. So Carter appoints Charles Ferris as chair of the FCC, and Ferris was all about shaking things up. He believed that all these existing regulations were actually stifling innovation and holding back progress.
Like he was a visionary, seeing the potential for change before it was obvious to everyone else.
Exactly. He saw the potential of new technologies, like cable television, and wanted to create a more competitive environment where those technologies could really flourish.
So what specific impact did Ferris's actions have?
Well, thanks to his deregulation efforts, cable TV just exploded in popularity.
Makes sense. We take it for granted now, but before cable, our choices were pretty limited.
Exactly. So that huge shift in the media landscape, the incredible variety of channels and programming options we have today, that's largely a result of deregulation.
Wow, so Jimmy Carter is responsible for my Netflix addiction. Who knew?
It's all connected. But it wasn't just about entertainment, though. The article also mentions something about the fairness doctrine.
Right, the Fairness Doctrine. What was that all about again?
Okay, so the fairness doctrine was this rule that required broadcasters to present contrasting viewpoints on controversial issues.
So the idea was to prevent any one viewpoint from dominating the airwaves.
Exactly. It was all about ensuring balance and preventing bias.
Interesting. So what did Carter's FCC do with it?
Well, they didn't completely eliminate it. That happened under Reagan, but they definitely started to loosen its enforcement, which paved the way for its eventual demise.
Okay, so Carter was already shaking things up in the media landscape before Reagan even came along. But was that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, ensuring balanced viewpoints sounds like a pretty good idea in principle.
It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides. Some people argue that weakening the fairness doctrine actually contributed to the rise of partisan media and those echo chambers we see today.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Others, though, say that it actually allowed for a wider range of voices and opinions to be heard. It's a debate that's still going on today, and it's interesting to see how Carter played a role in setting the stage for those discussions.
Wow, we've already covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how Carter challenged his own party with this fiscally conservative approach, and we've explored his surprisingly significant role in deregulating industries like airlines, trucking, energy, and even the media. This article is making a pretty compelling case that there's way more to Jimmy Carter than meets the eye.
Absolutely. And it doesn't stop there. The article goes even further, comparing Carter's conservative achievements to those of the Republican presidents who came after him.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. I'm ready to dive into that comparison.
All right, let's shift gears and see how Carter stacks up against the Republicans who followed him. I think you'll find it quite enlightening.
Okay, so let's get into this head-to-head between Carter and these Republican presidents who came after him. I'm ready to see how he measures up.
All right, well, we got to start with the Gipper himself, Ronald Reagan. Reagan's often hailed as, the union buster, especially with that whole air traffic controllers strike thing.
Right, that was a big moment in his presidency.
Definitely. But the article actually argues that when it comes to systemic change, Carter went way further by deregulating the entire airline industry.
So Carter was playing the long game,
Mm.
aiming for a broader, more lasting impact.
Exactly. And remember those cheap flights we talked about earlier? That's a direct result of Carter's deregulation efforts.
Okay.
Americans are flying way more now, like 4 times as many miles, at less than half the cost per mile, all thanks to what Carter set in motion. Reagan definitely built on that foundation, but it was Carter who really got the ball rolling.
Okay, yeah, that's a pretty compelling point. It's like he was planting the seeds for this whole more competitive, consumer-friendly airline industry. What about George H.W. Bush? How does Carter compare to him?
Bush Sr., he's mainly remembered for his foreign policy moves, sending troops to Kuwait, protecting those U.S. oil interests.
Right, the Gulf War.
Exactly. But Carter, through his energy deregulation policies, actually managed to cut American dependence on foreign oil imports by almost half.
Wow, so he was being proactive, trying to reduce our reliance on foreign oil rather than just reacting to crises when they popped up.
Exactly. He was thinking ahead. And those policies had a ripple effect, really setting the stage for greater energy independence down the line.
It's crazy how much impact a president can have on things that seem totally unrelated to their main agenda. Okay, so what about Bush's son, George W. Bush? How does Carter stack up against him?
Well, W. Bush, he really expanded the federal government's role in education, especially with that No Child Left Behind Act. Remember all those standardized tests?
Ugh, yeah, I remember those days.
Yeah.
Not my favorite memories from school.
Well, Carter had a very different philosophy when it came to education and honestly to the role of government in general. He was all about shrinking the size of the federal bureaucracy.
Wow.
Like, he actually eliminated entire federal agencies.
Really? Like which ones?
Well, for example, the Civil Aeronautics Board. They were the ones who regulated the airline industry before deregulation.
So he really put his money where his mouth was when it came to limited government. Interesting.
And finally, we get to Donald Trump. Now, under Trump, the federal debt to GDP ratio, it hit record levels.
Like how high are we talking?
It actually surpassed even the levels we saw during World War II.
Wow, that's a pretty scary thought.
Yeah, it's a bit alarming. And it really stands in contrast to Carter's approach to fiscal responsibility. He actually managed to bring that ratio down to its lowest point since the New Deal.
Hold on, so you're saying Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, was more fiscal conservative than a president who built his whole image on being this, like, super successful businessman?
It definitely makes you think, right? Of course, there are a lot of factors to consider when you're looking at a president's economic record, but this particular metric, it really highlights Carter's commitment to being fiscally prudent, which is usually something we associate with conservative ideology.
Okay, so we've gone through this whole lineup of Republican presidents, and it seems like this article's argument that Carter was the most successful conservative president of the last 5 decades, it might actually have some weight to it, or at least it's a perspective worth considering seriously. Why do you think this side of Carter's legacy is so often overlooked?
Well, it's a tough question. Part of it might be that whole Democratic Party label. I mean, it's hard for some people to wrap their heads around his conservative accomplishments when they think of him as a Democrat. It's like seeing a zebra with polka dots. It just doesn't compute.
Right, it's like he broke the mold, defied those categories we like to put politicians in.
Exactly. Plus, the full effects of some of his policies, like deregulation, didn't really become clear until after he was out of office. It's easier to give credit to the person in charge when things are going well, even if the groundwork was laid by someone else.
Yeah, it's like someone else getting to enjoy the shade from the tree you planted years ago.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the media. Those images and stories that really stick in our minds about Carter's presidency, they often focus on the tough times, like the Iran hostage crisis, the energy crisis.
Yeah, those were definitely defining moments of his presidency.
For sure. And while they were huge events, they don't tell the whole story. Those deregulatory achievements, his focus on fiscal responsibility, those parts of his legacy often get lost in the shuffle.
So are we saying we need to rewrite history here? Was Jimmy Carter secretly a conservative all along?
I wouldn't go that far. Carter was a complex guy, and trying to pigeonhole him into any one ideological category is probably oversimplifying things. But what this deep dive shows us is how important it is to challenge our assumptions, to look beyond the surface. It reminds us that history is often way more nuanced and surprising than we might initially think.
It's like we've been looking at a puzzle with only half the pieces, and now we're finally starting to see the full picture.
That's a great way to put it, and that's what makes this exploration so fascinating. We're piecing together a more complete understanding of Jimmy Carter, a man who defied easy categorization, whose legacy is much richer and more complex than many people realize.
This conversation has really got me thinking about how we tend to label politicians, and then we just view everything they do through that lens without ever considering that those labels might not be totally accurate or tell the whole story.
You're absolutely right. Political labels can be helpful to some extent, but they can also be really limiting. They can stop us from seeing the full picture, from appreciating how complex someone's beliefs and actions can be.
So in a way, Carter's story is kind of a cautionary tale about the dangers of relying too much on those labels.
I think so. It encourages us to think critically, to question those narratives we're given, and to be open to the possibility that things might not be as simple as they seem. And that's a valuable lesson no matter what your own political views are.
Okay, I think we did a pretty good job of unpacking this article and exploring the different sides of Carter's legacy.
Yeah.
It's been a wild ride, and I've definitely come away with a new perspective on Jimmy Carter.
I'm glad to hear that. It just goes to show that there's always more to learn, even about people we think we know well. And history is full of surprises just waiting to be uncovered.
For sure. But before we wrap things up, I have one last thought for our listeners. So the article ends by posing this really interesting question. If Carter had been a Republican, would we view his presidency differently today? Like, would we be celebrating all these accomplishments instead of focusing on what people saw as his weaknesses?
Yeah, it's a really thought-provoking question. It gets at the heart of how we tend to judge presidents. Would those economic policies have faced less opposition from his own party? Would his push for deregulation have been hailed as visionary instead of being met with all that skepticism? It makes you wonder if we're too quick to judge presidents based on that party label, that R or D, rather than looking at what they actually achieved.
It's like we're playing this alternate history game, right? Imagining a world where Carter had that R next to his name instead of a D, would we be looking at everything through a completely different lens?
It's definitely possible. Our perceptions are so often shaped by our own political leanings. We fall into that trap of praising the people who align with our views and criticizing those who don't, even when their actions might deserve a more nuanced take.
It's a good reminder that we all have those biases, and it's important to be aware of them when we're trying to understand historical figures.
Yeah.
Can't let our own political baggage cloud our judgment.
For sure. And it's not just about individual biases either. The media has a huge role in shaping public perception. Think about how certain presidents are always portrayed in this glowing light, while others are constantly being vilified, no matter what they actually did. It's like there's this pre-written script that just gets recycled over and over again.
You're so right. The media can totally influence how we see history. It's almost like a filter that can distort our understanding of events and even entire presidencies.
Exactly. And it's not always intentional. Journalists and historians, they bring their own perspectives and interpretations to the table, and those inevitably shape the stories they tell. That's why it's crucial to get our information from lots of different sources, to be critical of everything we read and hear. We can't just passively absorb that dominant narrative. We gotta dig a little deeper, form our own opinions based on the evidence.
So where does that leave us? Are we saying we should just toss out all those labels and completely disregard party affiliation?
Not necessarily. I mean, labels can be helpful. They can give us a general sense of someone's political philosophy, a framework for having discussions, but we have to be aware of their limitations. We can't use them to oversimplify complex issues or just dismiss people who don't fit neatly into those categories we've created in our heads.
It's about recognizing that people and their ideas don't always fit into those neat little boxes. There's always more to the story than meets the eye.
Absolutely. It's about being willing to challenge our own assumptions, to consider other perspectives, even if they make us a little uncomfortable. That's how we learn and grow.
Well said. I think this deep dive has been a great example of that, challenging those assumptions, broadening our understanding of a president we thought we knew. It's a good reminder that history's full of surprises and that there's always more to learn, even about someone as seemingly familiar as Jimmy Carter.
I completely agree. And Carter's story, it's a powerful reminder that those labels can be really deceiving and that true leadership can often cut across those partisan lines. His commitment to fiscal responsibility, deregulation, human rights, these are all things that deserve to be acknowledged and appreciated no matter what your political stance is.
So to our listeners, I'll leave you with this. Don't be afraid to question those accepted truths. The things everyone just assumes are true. Dig a little deeper, form your own opinions, and base them on what you find, not just on what everyone else is saying. And never underestimate the power of nuance. Sometimes those subtle details, the things that don't fit neatly into any category, those are the things that can give us the most profound insights. That's all for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us.